Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, I'll take you through the freight yard projects full of file boxcars that make up a Blazor project. We'll get down into the engine room and take a look at how the journey unfolds, from the main method departing in program.cs to that last caboose pulling into the browser station and making sure that we get there on time. That's coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train. Blazor Train! All right, so I'm going to walk through three solutions here. A Blazor Server application, a Blazor WebAssembly application that's hosted with an ASP.NET Server, and a standalone Blazor WebAssembly application. So I have three of them up here in three different instances of Visual Studio. I'm going to skip around a bit because you'll see how they relate to each other that way. Okay? Now this is the first episode of Blazor Train where I've actually got code to share. Now there isn't much code, it's just these defaults that come up when you create these solutions. But what it does have is comments. And you can see right here, let's start with program in the Blazor Server application, because this is where everything starts, and it says Carl says everything starts here. All right, so there you go. Well, that's where everything starts, so why don't we start there? Look at this. I host builder, create host builder. So this is the first thing that gets called from main, and it uses the startup class. So that's the next thing that loads is startup.cs. Now remember, we're starting with Blazor Server, okay? So startup.cs applies to all ASP.NET Core web applications, all of them, not just a Blazor application. And in this case, we're starting with configuration. And configuration is your app settings JSON file, you know, any other configurations that you have. But let's take a look at app settings JSON right now. Right here, there isn't much to it, but you can add, you know, connection strings. You're on the server, so you can add secrets and keys that you need to access, you know, Azure resources or other cloud resources. Put them all in here, no problem. Nobody's ever going to see them because they're all on the server. So this is, again, where you can add all your settings. Oh, I forgot to tell you that every once in a while we're going to come across a tip. And when I say tip, like that, yeah, that was my idea. Yeah, it was. All right. Whatever. Anyway, so in a Blazor WebAssembly application, in the default template, there is no app settings JSON file there by default, but you can add one. You can just right click on the project, select add new item, search for app settings, and you're off to the races. Okay, back to startup. So we got our configuration, that's good. Next thing that's going to run is configure services. And this is the difference between configure services and configure is confusing to some people. So let me explain it. I'm going to explain it to you. Okay. So configure services is where you set up classes for dependency injection. And they might have some properties that you can set on them as well. Configure specifies the middleware pipeline for a request. And it happens in order. So a request comes in, you go right down through the pipeline of all the middleware, and middleware is just that. It's everything between when a request comes in and the response goes out. So here in configure services, we can add services like Razor pages. That might be important in a Blazor application. Hey, it's time for another tip. Kill me. All right, so you can see here this add server-side Blazor, which is also kind of important in a Blazor application, I would say. But I have a tip here that says that you can use this add hub options to configure or set options on the SignalR hub, right? That Blazor server uses for the communication back and forth between the browser and the server. So in this case, I had to do this myself because I was sending too much data. And by sending data, I wasn't really sending it, but I was actually, generating data, and then I wanted to show that in a component or use it in a component. So I call a method, and because it's on the server, there has to be some server communication back and forth, and the message was too big. So this is how you can expand that maximum received message size for the Signal Arho. That's pretty cool. Okay, now, and again, I'm not changing anything in this code. This is the code that comes in the templates for these projects. I've just added comments, okay? So the next one you'll see is add singleton for a weather forecast service. Now, I mentioned before the differences between singletons and scoped services. We'll talk about a third one called transient services in a minute. But singleton services share a single instance between all pages and all users, right? So there's only ever one instance of a singleton. Oh, it's time for another tip. Well, I've discovered that if you launch one of your pages with JavaScript, like window open in a new tab or a pop-up window, that page won't have access to your scoped services. Why? Why do you think? Well, because it's a completely different page. It's a completely different request with a different user. Remember, this is a SPA framework, single page application. Once you start moving across the tabs and to windows that pop up, you got an issue. Okay, now let's go down to configure. This is where we configure the middleware, right? So these various middleware components are called in the order that they appear here in the list. And this is good to know, because if you implement something from documentation that you see, if it's good documentation, it will say you should put this before or after such and such. That's like standard middleware, so you know where to place it in the chain. But if you think about it a little bit, you can probably figure out, if it's a position issue, if it's not working, because it may be dependent on other middleware that needs to load first, right? Take a look at this. If the environment is development, we're going to use the developer exception page, which is either in index.html or _hosts.cshtml for a Blazor server. Otherwise, we're going to use an exception handler and call this page here error. All right. So yeah, you can see that I have the UI right there in there for reference. Next, use HTTPS redirection. So that redirects regular HTTP calls to HTTPS calls. Important. Next, use static files. Also important if you want to use things like CSS files, JavaScript files, images, those kinds of things. Those are static files. Routing. So routing is responsible for matching incoming requests and dispatching those requests to the app's executable endpoints. Now, you might think of an endpoint like a page. A page is an endpoint, but there are other endpoints as well. So you can configure those endpoints right down here, and this is right out of the documentation, folks. Endpoints are the app's units of executable request handling code. So they're defined in the app and configured when the app starts. The endpoint matching process can extract values from the request's URL and provide those values for request processing. Using endpoint information from the app, routing is also able to generate URLs that map to endpoints. So, if you've been doing any kind of ASP.NET, MVC, or Core, or Web API, you know about endpoints and routing already. But if you're new to Blazor and you're new to this whole ecosystem, you might not understand that. So the most typical configuration is to route all the requests to a Razor page. In the case of Blazor, it's _host.cshtml. So the fallback page is host cshtml. Okay, that's for every page that gets loaded first, and we'll go there in just a minute. Let's jump over to the WASM hosted project first. So this is Blazor WASM. And you'll notice that I've got my 3 projects here. I got Blazor WASM client at the top, which runs in the browser. I've got Blazor WASM server over here, and then I've got the shared project. So the program is a little bit different here. The main in the program.cs. Okay? Everything starts here in the browser, but now we've got this builder that's used to configure services. And look at this. Here's our old friend, the app object. Okay? So the app object in Blazor Server contains, and in Blazor WASM, contains all of the UI, all the components, all the pages are in that app right there. And now remember I told you about transient services. Well, you don't add services, first of all, in a startup CS file in Blazor WASM. You do it right here in program with builder.services.add scoped, add transient. In this case, we're adding a transient service, which means that it's going to come and go when the page is executing. And it's only, it's sort of like a page level variable. It's going to go away when you navigate away from that page. So why not just create a new HTTP client in the page? Why not? Why do we need to add it as a transient service? Well, because we can configure it. We can configure it with the base address. That's why we're doing it there. Okay? Oh, it's time for a tip. Okay, the tip is this. In a WASM app, there's no difference between a scoped and a singleton service in terms of its lifetime. There's only one client, the browser user. So whereas in a Blazor Server application, you got a singleton which has one instance that's shared among all clients, and a scoped service which has an instance for each client. Okay? Here, it doesn't matter. They're both the same. And you can use either one, but they behave exactly the same. That's my tip. All right, let's check out app.razor. Now we're still in the Blazor WASM client right here. So app.razor is the root component of the app that sets up client-side routing using the router component. And that intercepts browser navigation and renders the page that matches that route. So the pages folder contains the routable components. And you can tell the pages because they start with an @page directive. So in Blazor Server, every page includes _host CS.html, whereas in Blazor WebAssembly, every page includes index.html. Oh, it's time for a tip. So just because it's called a page doesn't mean it's actually a new page, like a new HTTP request in an MVC or web forms application. Because Blazor is a single page application or SPA framework. Even though there are multiple routes, there is only one page. And that's the same for Blazor Server, Blazor WASM, doesn't matter. There's only one page. Even though you go to counter and fetch data, those are just loading different routable components in the same page, but the page doesn't change. Here's your tip. So let's look at index.html. And this is, again, in the web root of Blazor WASM client. So we'll take a look here. Look, it's just standard HTML. We've got a header and some metadata and a title. We got to have this base route right here. That's important. Now these two CSS files, a bootstrap file and your app.css, those are there to support the default Blazor UI template. If you want, you can completely remove them. Ah yes, time for another tip. If you want to use Bootstrap but find it's interfering with your own CSS, you can create a custom Bootstrap CSS file that omits things that typically get in the way, like jQuery or the grid system, always getting in the way of layout. So go to getbootstrap.com/docs/3.4/customize, and you can deselect the things in Bootstrap that you don't want in your CSS file and then download it. And now you can use it. I found this out the hard way when I was trying to do some Flexbox stuff, which I'll show you in an upcoming episode because it's way cool. And I wanted the button styles and all the styles for the UI elements, but I didn't want the grid system because that, I wanted to control with Flexboxes where everything is on the screen. So I just deselected the grid system, downloaded the CSS file, boom, Bob's your uncle. So again, you don't have to use these CSS files in your application if you don't want to. All right, now we're getting down into the body. And the body really is this right here, app. You remember over in program, this guy right here, app? Well, that app essentially is right here in index.html. So it's a placeholder for all of the UI. That's good. This whole div here is for unhandled exceptions, for dealing with them. And then here's the JavaScript that needs to load to support Blazor. Yes, there's JavaScript underneath here. And in this case, in the WebAssembly version of Blazor, this is a shim that downloads the .NET runtime, which is a CLR and base class libraries, the app, all of the dependencies, all the DLLs, all the assemblies, and it initializes the runtime to run the app. So that's what that does. Let's jump over to Blazor Server. Now, Blazor Server, where were we? We were in startup. So let's take a look at app.razor. Looks exactly the same. Exactly the same as the client. No difference. The only difference here is instead of using index.html, we're going here and loading _host CSHTML, which is the default route. So again, we've got our href, our default route. The same Bootstrap stuff applies. And now here the app is actually a component, right? You also get an option to toggle pre-rendering. So it's on by default. If you want to turn it off, you just change this to server. Those are the two options, server and server pre-rendered. But you might find that you're not a fan of having your initialize virtual method and your on parameters set happening multiple times because you're making calls into a database, and if you do it over and over again, I mean, that's a lot of wasted bandwidth and it's a lot of wasted compute. So you might want to turn server pre-rendering off, but it does, make things a little bit faster. So again, here's your error div, and here's the JavaScript for server. Now, Blazor Server, it's a little bit different. So this is the shim that hooks the DOM, hooks all the browser events, and then forwards those up via SignalR to the server, gets the SignalR messages back from the server, and then updates the DOM. So that's how that works. All right. Going back to app.razor, we see this main layout right here. What is that? Well, it's a shared component, main layout, and it also loads nav menu. Now, you don't have to use nav menu, and you certainly don't have to have a main layout, but you do have to use this main layout, or something that inherits layout component base, but you don't have to have all this goo here. All right, so this is just to support the default template that comes with Blazor. This is really all you need right here at body. All right, that encompasses everything that your page displays. But what this is sort of like a master page in web forms, right? So this is a template that for every page, it's going to show this. It's going to show a nav bar down the side, and then in the main area at the top, it's going to have a little header, and then the content, the body, your stuff in that page. Now, like I said, you can take all that out if you want to. But while we're here, let's look at nav bar, nav menu rather. So it's a component just like any other in Blazor, and it's used in the default template to create that sidebar along the left-hand side of the browser. So you don't need to use it, as I said before, but there are some cool things here, like the nav link. And nav link combines a link with, you know, buttons and icons and stuff like that. It does matching to routes, so you can also utilize authentication or authorization rather. We'll talk about that in an upcoming thing. So navlink is just kind of a hyperlink on steroids in Blazor land. And this is exactly the same nav menu and main layout, exactly the same in WebAssembly, both WebAssembly types, as it is in Blazor Server. All right, now let's talk about data, because the fetch data page, component, routable page, whatever we can call it, is different for each one of these three solutions. So let's look at it in Blazor Server, and you've seen it. Basically, it just shows a table of weather forecast, bogus weather forecast data. But there's a data folder here in the server, and we have a model, weather forecast, and we have a service, weather forecast service. Remember, we added this as a singleton service. So weather forecast is just a class with some fields. Okay. Another tip. In Blazor WebAssembly, the client uses an HTTP client to call an API controller to get this weather forecast. It's not the same. Hey, but you knew that already. That wasn't really a tip. Okay, let's look at the weather forecast service. This is just a class with some data in a string array, and we're randomly pulling things up from it and displaying them. It's all here on the server. We don't need an API. We don't need anything else because we're already on the server. And if you look at fetch data.razor, we're injecting that singleton weather forecast service, and then we're just calling get forecast async. It's just a local class. That's it. Now contrast that with Blazor WASM, where over here on the server we've got a controllers folder and a weather forecast controller here, and the model is in a completely different project that is shared between the server and the client. Well, why? Server and the client both need access to the model, so that's why. And this is just a .NET standard class library. That's all it is. So the weather forecast controller on the server here is just a standard web API controller. That's all there is to it. It's got an HTTP GET. That's it. Gets some stuff, sends it back. So how does fetch data look in the Blazor WASM client? Well, guess what? We've got this injected HTTP client here. And remember, it's got the base address set. And now let's go down to where we're calling the weather forecast API. Because the base URL is set, or the base address is set, we can use a relative URL. And then that's pulling back your array of weather forecasts. So it's different. Different still in a standalone Blazor application. Let's take a look at that. So here's your program. It's exactly the same. Everything is exactly the same. This is different though, fetch data. Look at that, an HTTP client in fetch data. Why is that? Why would we need that? Where's the controller? I don't see any controller. Confuso. Okay, so here's what's going on. Take a look, you'll get it. Our weather forecast model is right here in the page. Doesn't need to be anywhere else. Look at this. We're using HTTP to call get from JSON async an array of weather forecasts sample-data / weather.json. And I look up in my web root, sample-data weather.json. Who knew? Well, I did. Take a look at that, and guess what? It's just got some records. So this isn't prescriptive. You know, they're not saying that, hey, if you have a self-contained WebAssembly application, that you should just load data from a file. That's not what they're saying. They need a demo so that you can create something and run it and it works, right? So without an API controller to call into, you're going to need to get that data from somewhere. So that's why they did it this way. I'm sure of it. So that's all I got. Now we've gone through all these files and all of these different projects, and by now you have a good idea of what all these little pieces mean and how you can start tweaking them and getting around them. Wow, that was about as much fun as it could possibly be, wasn't it? Whoa, whoa! And if you thought that was fun, wait until the next episode of Blazor Train, where we'll dive into the wonderful world of routing. Or is it rooting? Rooting? Route? Oh, that's Canadian. Root? All right, I'll go with root. Rooting. No, it doesn't sound good. Routing. We'll go with routing. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blazor Train!